I am very happy to welcome Michael Gabizon, who is here with me, well, online in the great city of Montreal, Montreal. Michael Gabizon is from Montreal originally, is that correct?
That is correct. Born and raised here.
And we met, I think, we brought it up just before I clicked the record button, maybe the first time in 2016 at the Enoch graduate seminar, perhaps before, but definitely
So
we
I,
had
I
some
was
good
put into
conversations there.
contact. Yeah, I was put into contact with you a little bit earlier when I was looking into PhD programs,
Ah.
and then you and I met at SBL. You were very kind. You invited me to the Enoch gathering there, and then we had the graduate seminar where we spent more time together.
At the University of Texas in Austin. And already at that time, your research was focusing on the question of intermarriage and
Hmm.
social boundaries in the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple period, which is what we're going to talk about today here in this episode that I call Two Scholars and a Talmud, drawing inspiration from two guys in a truck. I don't know if they have that in Quebec, Canada,
But
but
yeah,
at
yeah,
least
I don't
in the
know.
US. So your dissertation is under contract with Brill, so that's exciting. Forthcoming as titled "Children from Intermarried Couples in the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Period." You've published on topics related to messianism, the parting of the ways, as it's known in scholarship, between Christianity and Judaism, as well as Paul within Judaism. You taught at the King's University and recently completed a one-year appointment as associate professor of Jewish studies at the Moody Bible Institute before coming back to Montreal, Quebec, where you continue to write and teach and raise four children.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
Michael, thanks for your time, for sharing your expertise. It's such a apropos topic,
Hmm.
especially in the diaspora in North America. Since I've arrived here in Montreal myself, I've been hopping around, visiting different Jewish communities, and this issue of intermarriage comes up quite frequently. So, what we're going to do today is, in anticipation of the publication of your book, you've prepared for us a nice handout with texts and different presentations. And I'll just be your conversation partner. And we're going to have a discussion about, well, who's Jewish, what are intermarried couples, and how these were perceived in the Hebrew Bible and the Second Temple period.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Isaac, for having me. It's great to see you again, and I am very glad that we could both be in Montreal. It's the first time we both lived in the in close quarters, so happy about that. Excuse me. So, yeah, as the title says, it's a bit of a mouthful, but I focus on children from intermarried couples in the Hebrew Bible and early Judaism or Second Temple period. And essentially, what that means is I look at how their identity was constructed. So, was a child considered Jewish because the father was Jewish? Were they considered Jewish because the mother? Was there another factor like their geographical location, their piety, their cultic affiliation? What actually constructed their identity? And, as you mentioned, I've been thinking about this topic for a long, long time. Even growing up in Montreal, I grew up in a relatively Jewish neighborhood, and I remember just the concentric circles of identity that some people would claim to be Jewish and others would say no, they're not Jewish, and how that all functioned. And I remember early on, someone gave me this paradigm where they said, well, in the Hebrew Bible, Jewishness runs through the father, it's patrilineal, but then the rabbis changed it and it runs through the mother. And of course, the million dollar question is, well, why? Why would they have changed it if that's really the case? But more than that, the lived reality is just a little bit different depending on your community. I had good friends who their mother was Jewish, the father was not, but they would claim to be mixed or half Jewish was the term that they used. I had a buddy who actually grew up part of the Karaite tradition, and he would claim, no, Jewishness is part of, it goes through the father. What happens with people who convert? Some people would say they're still Jewish, others would say they're not. So it was always very fascinating to me. But at the time that you and I started to connect together, and I was getting into a PhD program, which I did at McMaster University, I started to focus in on that question in 2015 on, okay, why did the matrilineal principle happen? In 200 CE around with the codification of the Mishnah, we have this regulation that essentially if a Jewish man marries a Gentile woman, then the child would be considered as the mother, he or she would be considered Gentile. And that seems to stand in stark contrast to what we find in the Hebrew Bible. You know, when you look at cases, whether Judah, that we're going to discuss here, or Moses, who they married Gentiles, and yet their children were either considered part of the tribe or were even considered part of the, or like were Levites. So initially, I was trying to see the underpinnings of, okay, why did the matrilineal principle happen? What was going on there? And that's when I started to read a lot of Shai Cohen's work, The Beginnings of Jewishness, which is phenomenal. He has a whole chapter on this, dealing with it, which was very helpful for me. But as I started to think, okay, what am I going to write my dissertation on? As much as I was focusing kind of on that matrilineal principle and right before, I started to broaden the lens to, okay, what happened before there was a principle, before there was kind of an authoritative ruling on who is Jewish. When you look at the Hebrew Bible all the way up to what I call pre-Mishnaic Jewish literature, how is Jewish identity constructed? And again, when you look at that literature, you also see quite a bit of diversity. And hopefully, you know, as we get into these, into some of the examples, I'll be able to highlight some of those here. But, you know, the major one, if I ever have to give an elevator pitch to, you know, what I research and why it's important, I would always just contrast, you know, Moses married someone who was not a Hebrew or part of the tribe, and the children were considered Levites. And yet, at the time of Ezra, someone with the exact same genealogy, a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, was kicked out because they were not considered Jewish. So why do you have that difference in the Hebrew Bible, and what else is going on?
Yeah, no,
So that's, yeah, go ahead.
no, that's really interesting. I mean, just that we have perhaps already some diversity on this issue, diverse viewpoints in ancient times, ancient Judaism. Uh, that speaks in a way to the contemporary debates about Jewishness, right? For our viewers that might not know about this, in rabbinic Judaism, which has largely defined most forms of Judaism, uh, i- in the foundational document, which is the Mishnah, the earliest document of rabbinic Judaism, on which the Talmud itself is built, Jewishness is according to descent, and it runs through the mother. You
Mhm.
can become a Jew, but you're a Jew if you're born to a mother who is Jewish. And so that becomes the dominant view. Although you mentioned the Karaites, so
Yes,
we
yeah,
shouldn't forget the mighty Karaites. They're very few today, but they were a force for rabbinic Jews to reckon with during the medieval period and even up into the early modern period. And Karaite Jews we follow only the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, as we see it, Jewishness runs through the father, so that would be called the patrilineal principle. And today we have mutations, or fractures in modern day Judaism, where Reform Judaism will accept the Jewishness of a child born to a mother or a father who's Jewish, although often the assumption is that the child will be raised Jewish. There's Reconstructionists, a very tiny minority, but they're present in Montreal as well, as I saw on the map. And there too, there would be a similar approach as the Reform Jews. I was thinking also earlier, they're not quite Jews, but the Samaritans, they
right.
view themselves and are considered Israelites. If I'm not mistaken, it runs through the father as well. So
Hmm.
there are a lot of viewpoints. Orthodoxy kind of gets maybe most of the attention because they have, and it's nothing against Orthodox Judaism. These are just observations about social realities, seeing that the Orthodoxy has a certain official say in who is considered a Jew or treated as such in the state of Israel. This creates other divisions within the Jewish world about who's considered a Jew. If somebody converts to Reform Judaism, well, that person won't be considered a Jew by
Right.
the rabbinate in Israel, and then can uh, basically encounter certain problems and obstacles in that way. So it's very much an apropos, exciting
Yeah.
topic that people are really interested about assimilation, especially in the U.S. and perhaps here too in Canada. Intermarried couples, what happens to the child? Is the child Jewish? Is the child going to be raised Jewish? Is the child going to remain Jewish? So
Yeah.
you really chose if I may, a very hot, interesting topic for your
Yeah.
for your
And
dissertation
listen,
and as a book.
And as you mentioned, I mean, a lot of work is being done on it towards the end of my dissertation, because I obviously deal with antiquity, which, for better or for worse, isn't always so applicable to today.
Hmm.
But, there's a Pew Research that I referenced at 2021 where it said that children from intermarried couples are much more likely to identify as Jewish today as opposed to, say, 50 years ago. So you see a strengthening or a greater desire to be part of it. Karen McGinnity, I believe is her name, where she's written on intermarriage and the status of children. Her work is Marrying Out, if I remember correctly, and she comes to the same conclusion that children are more likely to identify as Jewish. Now, granted, usually when the mother's Jewish, they have kind of that stronger bond, but she doesn't attribute it to any like metaphysical reality. It's more just that fathers tend to take more of a passive role insofar as raising the children, and so the mother kind of brings her traditions. But nevertheless, I think it's a very important topic, and I think that there's a lot of emotional turmoil for people, whether
Hmm.
they're in, whether they're out, and some of the kind of exclusionary models that are difficult to circumvent. So I just wanted to provide more of a framework when you're looking at the Hebrew Bible to at least move beyond this, patrilineal to matrilineal. And you're absolutely right. Just like there's a lot of diversity today, it's like, who is a Jew? Well, it depends who you ask. I don't want to say it's equally the same way in the Hebrew Bible, but there is no monolithic or diachronic thing that we could trace. There was diversity. And not to get too technical, but then, if you take a step back, it's obviously contingent on, well, when do you date the texts and when were they written? What are they responding to? And all that comes into play. But yeah, what I wanted to do here was essentially provide kind of a bird's eye view of how mixed children were treated in the Hebrew Bible at Second Temple period, which I have right over here. How were the mixed offspring treated? And I have a couple of different categories that I'll give you, a little bit of a snapshot on what each of them means, and then we'll go through some examples, hopefully more familiar ones, so that we could kind of root these examples in text that we already know. But before that, I wanted to quickly discuss models of descent. So I view the transmission of, I'm using the term Jewishness. Obviously, in the Hebrew Bible, we don't use that term. Whether it's Hebrew or Israelite or Yehudi or Judean and all that development. The main point is that it's predominantly a genealogical link. That's the most common thing that we see. And so I have here, I work with a couple of different models of descent. In the Hebrew Bible, there really is no category for conversion. So you're either born Jewish or you're not. And so the first one here is patrilineal descent. And I have these little I don't want to say like washroom people,
Right.
bathroom people, but to kind of exemplify what it represents, where the blue means the father is Jewish,
Uh-huh.
and the black means that the mother is not Jewish. So
Can
in
I just say, can
patrilineal,
I just say one thing? Yeah, just
yeah,
before you begin the patrilineal principle,
go
because
ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. For many viewers, this might be, counterintuitive, difficult to wrap their minds around, because many are so used to just thinking of Jewish identity or Israelite identity as a religious category.
Mm,
And to hear that you can't convert or you couldn't convert, right, during the time when the Hebrew Bible was written to Judaism, might
yeah.
be surprising. But that, well, yeah, I mean, Israel originally was, uh, let's say, a confederation of sorts of 12 tribes, and tribal identity, even today, and when we're talking of contemporary tribes, you don't convert to Navajoism. It would just sound weird, right?
Mhm.
I'm using that, maybe it's a bit anachronistic, as an illustration for a public audience that, identity here is, as you said, genealogical. You're born into the tribe. If you're a member of a tribe, it's because you're born into the tribe. Your parents were part of this tribe, and this is who you are. This is the community to which you belong. Conversion is something more of like a religious category that's going to eventually become possible in
Right.
Judaism. One can convert to Judaism today, to all forms of Judaism, if one wishes or desires so, but that's not quite what's going on here, at this stage. So I'm sorry,
No,
just
no,
want to
I love it, and it's
plug that
such an
in there.
important point. And obviously, with any statement needs qualifiers, but when we say you can't convert in the Hebrew Bible, it obviously depends on how you interpret Esther, because that's really kind of the first time that you see towards the end of Esther where it says that they became Jews. And what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Is that really the start of conversion? But then you see that more often in Second Temple literature, whether with Judith. Josephus was a fan of it, but there were other communities who safeguarded against that and said, no, Jubilees is one of those examples where a conversion was not possible, and it was strictly genealogical. So you do see that a little bit of a wrestling match in Second Temple period, but then ultimately, as you noted, today it is most definitely possible to convert according to Judaism as we know it.
So yes, take us back to these models. They're very interesting.
Okay. All right. So the patrilineal principle is kind of the default position. This is what we consider the Hebrew Bible to be, where you're Jewish if your father's Jewish, which makes sense because that's the model that we see most often. In Numbers, there's that common passage where you are attributed to the tribe of your father. Now, there has been pushback to say that the Hebrew Bible is strictly patrilineal, because that would mean that the mother's genealogy is not all that important. But there are several cases where it is quite important. We just have to go to Isaac and Ishmael, for example, where the genealogy of Sarah and Hagar were quite important for determining the status of the child. You also see cases where there's a child with a Jewish mother and a Gentile father, and they're considered Jewish. Amasa in Deuteronomistic history, he is considered Jewish. Attai in First Chronicles. I mean, these are just kind of examples that I'm throwing out, but it shows that because the mother's Jewish, the child was considered Jewish as well. Now, it's not across the board. You do have exceptions to it, but it does call into question, is this strictly a patrilineal model, that it only goes through the father? And I don't know if we can make that claim. The Hebrew Bible is, if I can use the term, it's largely patriarchal. Mm-hmm. So the father is, the head of the household. It's patrilocal, meaning that when they get married, they go live with the father and his household. And so in that sense, that's why the identity is often from the father. I don't know if I would say it's strictly patrilineal. In my research, actually, the only author that I would make the argument was like strictly patrilineal, it only goes through the father, is Josephus, where he seems to really focus on the father's lineage. In cases where a Jewish man married a Gentile, he has no problem with that. He doesn't condemn it. The child's Jewish. In cases where a Jewish woman marries a non-converted man, that's what he condemns, and that's what he finds problematic. It's actually really fascinating if your readers or your watchers are ever interested in the genre we call rewritten Bible, where in Second Temple literature they'll kind of retell a story, whether from Genesis or Exodus. And what I love about that is, by virtue of them retelling it, the details they include, the details they exclude, what they have to fill in, that shows you their priorities. Right. It shows you what they really want you to walk away with. And there are several examples of Josephus where he will take, for example, Hiram of Tyre. This guy is in First Kings. He helps build the temple under Solomon. And Hiram of Tyre has a Jewish mother and a Gentile father. And it gives us his genealogy. He's not called an Israelite, but he just tells us he has a Jewish mother. And Josephus takes that story and he makes Hiram of Tyre have both a Jewish mother and a Jewish father. Because for him, Jewishness runs through the father. And if the guy's working on the temple, he needs to be Jewish. In another case, Jephthah in Judges 11, he had a Jewish father and he was the son of a prostitute. And for Josephus, that was very problematic. So he changed Jephthah's lineage, that he had a Jewish father and a Gentile mother. That was better for Josephus than being son of a prostitute. So all that to say, Josephus was really the only one I found that was like strictly patrilineal. And of course, the $1 million question, why? Nancy J makes the argument that one of Josephus's purposes was to show the legitimacy and the antiquity of the Jewish people to the Romans. And because they had such an emphasis on patrilineal descent, whether it was a conviction he himself had, we don't know, but nevertheless, that's how he constructed Jewish identity. So, patrilineal descent only through the father. It's kind of the default position that we have for the Hebrew Bible, but it requires some nuance. Next, we have the matrilineal principle, right over here, where the mother is Jewish, the father is not. And again, you don't ever find any clear case of a strictly matrilineal principle in the Hebrew Bible, where it could only go through the mother. You do have that fascinating case with Ezra, which we're going to look at below. And as a little kind of precursor to it, Ezra in Ezra 9, he goes back to the Judean community. He sees they intermarried, and he kicks out all the foreign wives and their children. And why? Why did he do that? So some argue that's the start of the matrilineal principle.
Right.
If that's the case, you don't really hear about it or see it practiced for the next few hundred years, but we could see if there's some merit to that. But the real articulation of the matrilineal principle, I have it here, and it's in Mishnah Kiddushin 3:12, where there are really kind of two parts to it. Do you want to read it?
Sure. Yeah. So it says, and in any case where a woman cannot join in betrothal with him or with others, the offspring is like her. He is not considered his father's son at all, but has the same status as his mother. And in which case is this applicable? This is the offspring of a Canaanite maidservant or a Gentile woman, as her child is a slave or a Gentile like her.
Right. So for the first time, somewhat antithetical to examples we find in the Hebrew Bible, if a Jewish man marries a Gentile woman, the child will be like her and be a Gentile. In another part in the Mishnah, in Yevamot 7:5, I believe, if a Jewish woman marries a Gentile man, the child will be a mamzer. Now that ruling is later changed to the child will just be Jewish, but by virtue of being a mamzer usually means it's a child of an illicit union, still considered part of the Jewish people, yet subjugated to some extent, limited in terms of who they can marry and their participation in that sense. But all that to say, we don't have any examples, a strict example of the matrilineal principle. As you noted, even today within rabbinic Judaism, there have been breaks from it. The Reconstructionist movement, the Reform movement in the 80s broke from it. And there's that ongoing conversation. And now that you have land kind of mixed into the conversation, with Israel, and you have people who were born there, and mixed offspring, like how is their identity being constructed? It's another element that's quite fascinating to consider. So that's the matrilineal. Next, you have ambilineal, which is a category that I use most often, and I would argue that lineage is transmitted through either the father or the mother. And I think this is the example that we find. There are other factors in place, like where they were born, but nevertheless, I think that it could go through either the father or the mother in the Hebrew Bible, most generally. There are some, as I mentioned, there are some other factors involved which we could touch on. And then the last example here is bilineal. So bilineal descent means both your father and your mother need to be Jewish for you to be Jewish. So it can't be either or, it can't just be the father, it cannot just be the mother, it needs to be both. And this was initially a criterion provided to the priests. We have it right here in Leviticus 21, where because the priests were set apart, their seed was set apart, they were designated to do an important task. The regulation was given that the person that they marry, the priest, he shall marry a virgin of his own kin. Whether his own kin means an Israelite or specifically someone from the Levites is debated, but nevertheless, most definitely not someone from outside the Israelite community. He must marry someone of his own kin that he may not profane his offspring. So in other words, if a priest marries someone from outside, his child will no longer be considered holy and take part. And so that was kind of a priestly criterion. Both parents had to be Jewish for the child to be Jewish. And what we see happening in some communities is they take that priestly criterion and they apply it to all of Israel. So everyone needs to marry someone who's Jewish, otherwise your child will not be considered holy. So these are kind of the four main categories of lineage that people deal with when we're looking at the Hebrew Bible. And so, as I mentioned, we're primarily going to look at ambilineal, but I just wanted to provide this as a framework as we move forward to discuss how lineage and identity is transmitted. Anything unclear? Anything you want to comment
No,
on?
I mean I've got a lot of questions, but I don't want to interrupt you. I suppose some of the questions I have are going to be are anticipated in the following texts that you have to propose here, and so I'll
Okay.
just keep them for that point. Maybe I'll just for our viewers, Josephus was a Jewish historian, Jewish priest from the first century of the Common Era, and he wrote a lot of great important books for our understanding of Judaism in antiquity. And one of them is Jewish Antiquities, where he's basically retelling the story of Israel from the very beginning. I mean, even starting with Genesis all the way to his time. And as he's retelling those stories, as you were saying, which is interesting, I wasn't aware of that myself. He's trying to argue that Jewish or Israelite identity is absolutely patrilineal. And so when he's
Mhm.
coming across certain figures in the Hebrew Bible who might seemingly be accepted as Jewish through the mother, but they have a father who's not Jewish, no, I'm going to point out that actually the father was Jewish because patrilineal principle is something that seems to be clearly displayed in Josephus's writing. So that's a very interesting remark.
All right. So here is a kind of a bird's eye view of how they were treated when you look at the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature. And again, I could place two communities or two texts both in the accepted category. That doesn't mean they agreed on how Jewishness was constructed. You could put Josephus in there, and you could put someone else who believed it was through the mother. Both children are accepted. Doesn't mean they agree. So this is kind of a simple bird's eye view. But essentially, four main categories. Of course, we have the extremes where we go from accepted right over here, which means that they were able to take part in marriage and cultic life. There doesn't seem to be any issue with them, ruling, anything like that. A great example we have, so Elephantini, not to do these like little sidetracks, but Elephantini, I'm deeply indebted to that community. They were formed. Oh, it was maybe like if I remember correctly, about 490 to about 399 BCE. And they were in Egypt. They were a Yehudi community. They identified as Judean. And we have a lot of contracts from them, whether, the sale of slaves or marriage contracts or lawsuits. And in the Elephantini corpus, you're able to trace literally two families, one of whom has a Jewish father and an Egyptian mother, and the other one has an Egyptian father and a Jewish mother. And you're able to trace those kids, and both of them were called Yehudi. They were named according to the Jewish ancestor. They seemed to be partaking in the community. They could get married. They could sue on behalf of their parents. So they seem to have all the rights that you would normally have as a legitimate offspring. So those are the people that comprise the accepted category, which is very common.
That's really
Next, we have
interesting. I mean,
yeah.
the Elephantini community. I didn't know. I mean, I knew about the Elephantini community. A lot of our viewers might not know this. This is an island on the Nile River that you can still visit today. When I went to Egypt on a boat, we navigated around the island. It's near I think it's Aswan in Luxor, Egypt. But a long time ago, fourth century thereabouts, you said.
Yeah.
BCE, there was actually a Jewish settlement community on this island, and we have some of their writings that
Hmm.
have survived time. And there are lists, you're saying there are lists there of Jewish families, genealogies, where in some cases the father is Jewish, but the mother is Egyptian.
Hmm.
And in other cases, it's the other way around, but they're both described as Yehudi, as Jewish.
Yep. And the children, when you're looking at the
The
children, yeah, they're
children.
both
Mhm.
described that way. Yeah, I mean the community they had a temple. You have letters from them being written to the community in Judea asking for permission to rebuild the temple. So it's really fascinating the insight you get from it. Okay, next category is accepted. So they were still part of the community, but with limitations. So there's a couple of examples with this, but we're going to look below at the case of Nehemiah, where he sees children from intermarried couples, and he kind of freaks out because they cannot speak the Judean language. And we could just think, well, just teach them the Judean language. What's the problem with that? So,
Send them
we'll
to
look
Hebrew
into
day
that.
school.
There you go. Put them to an opan. It's 1, 2, 3. It's done. Next, we have excluded, which kind of like the priestly criterion that we have right over here. Excluded means that they're no longer considered part of the community. We kick them out, and we see that most clearly in the case of Ezra, which we're going to look at. And then finally, we have excluded but hybrid. So excluded just means you're profane. You're not part of the holy seed. You're out. You're not considered one of us. Excluded and hybrid means you're kind of this unnatural mixture where you're neither in nor you're out. And First Enoch and Jubilees, I argue, kind of deal with this category with the Watchers, which we're going to get to. And what's linked to that often is a type of moral impurity or a wickedness because you're this type of hybrid. So that would mean that children from intermarried couples are deemed inherently wicked. So that's kind of the fourth category that I deal with in outlining all of these.
I really like that you've mapped out 4 different categories because often this debate is viewed in a kind of binary way: Jewish or
Right.
not Jewish, Israelite or not Israelite. So having these 4 models together, including the 4 models for how mixed offspring were treated, but then also 4 models of descent. I find that to be very helpful.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad. All right, you ready to
Never
jump
heard the
in?
term ambilineal, I must say.
Yeah, ambilineal is a term. It's a sociological term.
Okay.
There's another one that's kind of I group them together, but there's another one that says that via lineage you can glean from your father and your mother simultaneously, and I just kind of group that in with ambilineal descent, and yeah. So let's jump into our accepted category. Again, there's a plethora of examples that we could use, but we're going to deal with ones that are a little bit more fun and I guess a little more well known. And here we have Genesis 38, and this kind of marks for you that we have a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. But Genesis 38 deals with the marriage of Judah. Now, Genesis 38, this is my argument. So for your readers, when you read Genesis 37 to Genesis 50, it's often what we call either the Joseph cycle or it's all about Joseph. And it's about him. He was betrayed. He went down to Egypt. You know the story. And he eventually redeemed his brothers, and they all went down there as well and reconciled. In Genesis 37, you have his betrayal. And if you read the end of Genesis 37 and then go to Genesis 39, it's almost seamless. Right? Genesis 38 is sort of this camera angle shift, which for whatever reason, we go to Judah, and we don't just go to Judah to see like what's going on with him. We go to Judah, and Judah marries, and he has kids, and he's looking for grandkids. Like, it's a long period of time. And then we just switch back to Joseph, back to where he was before. And so there's all this big question of like, why was Genesis 38 placed here? Temporally, it doesn't really mix. In terms of an argument from Genesis, what is the authors trying to convey with this? And there's a couple of different proposals. Some people say it heightens the tension with the Joseph story. Others say that just as Joseph kind of represents the northern kingdom, Judah represents the southern kingdom. All those make sense. What I would argue, though, is that the purpose of this Genesis 38 narrative is all about Judah's children. That's the main point of it. And I follow Esther Mann in her argument about this, and you're going to see here the verbs that are used. Essentially, what happens is in kind of Genesis 38, in part 1, Judah marries a Canaanite, and he has kids. And then in part 2, Judah needs to have grandchildren. And there's kind of this tension raised about how is he going to have these grandchildren. And ultimately he has them. But what I'm claiming here is that both the Canaanite woman as well as Tamar, who he marries, was likely a Canaanite as well. And yet there's no condemnation about the mixed children. There's no issue with that. So for all intents and purposes, they were considered Jewish. All right, that's kind of it in the kind of a snapshot. So would you be so kind, Isaac, to read through Genesis 38, 1 to 4?
Yeah, absolutely. So it happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira, or Hira, I guess, in English. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named her Er. Again she conceived and bore a son whom she named Onan. Yet again, she bore a son, and she named him Shelah.
Okay, perfect. So here we have our model. And notice in red, we kind of have these, sorry that this thing keeps popping up, but
Yeah, no
nevertheless,
problem.
just bear with me. I outlined them right over here, but essentially he took her, lakach, he took her, he married her. He went into her, he entered her, she conceived, she bore, she delivered, and then she named the children. And that's kind of the sequence that we find here. Three sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Obviously, in later Jewish literature, there was some discomfort with this idea that Judah had married a Canaanite woman. You know, when you look at earlier patriarchal narratives, there was a kind of a big emphasis of don't marry a Canaanite. You know, go back to the family with Rebecca, get someone from there, get the proper genealogy. Don't marry someone from here. But then around Genesis 32, you have a shift where you don't really see that emphasis happening anymore, and there's no inherent condemnation that you find with Judah's marriage to a Canaanite woman. Now, the narrative continues, you see here in verse 10, and it says here, Judah, because now he's looking for a grandchild, and he has to find a wife for his son. So Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So here we see the repetition of the first verb. Just as Judah took the Canaanite woman, here Judah took Tamar, and he took her for Er. Now, we don't know what happened. All the text says is that Er was wicked, and so God struck him and killed him. People later attribute it to the Canaanite mother. I don't think you can make that argument because not all the other kids were wicked. We don't know what he did so wrong. Ironically, Er backwards is Ra, which means wicked or evil. So I don't know how much of a standing chance he had, but nevertheless, he's struck dead. Then Judah goes to the second son, Onan, and he says to Onan, enter your brother's wife, right? Because that's the Levirate law. You would go into your brother's wife, and then she would conceive and bear a son for the deceased brother. So you have the second verb here. Judah took her, so he took Tamar. Judah entered the Canaanite woman, Onan entered Tamar. But then she couldn't conceive. Why? Because Onan spilled his seed on the ground, and God killed him for that, because of that wickedness. So this leaves you with this tension of, well, how is Tamar going to conceive? How are the children of Judah going to come about? Now, long story short, Tamar takes things into her own hands. She dresses up as a prostitute. She goes to Judah, and Judah essentially fulfills all the verbs that we're looking for, that he did with the Canaanite. So Judah gave the pledges that he's going to pay Tamar, and then it says Judah went into her, Bo, so he entered. Tamar conceived, just as we have here, conceived. And then when the time came, she delivered. Again, the verbs here, delivered, and the children were named. So essentially, part 1 of Genesis 38 sets up this kind of model of 5 verbs of having these children. And then in the second part, Tamar is the heroine, because she's the one who completes the verbal sequence, and she's the one who has the children, Perez and Zerah, who become very important for Judah's line. Now, why do I bring all this up? Seems like a little bit of detail to show that Genesis 38, the purpose of it was really about Judah's progeny. It was about the descendants that were going to come from Judah, and in both cases, he's married to a non-Jew or someone who's not part of his family. He's married to a Canaanite, and yet there's no issue with that when we trace these children. And so I have this final in Numbers 26:20, as well as in First Chronicles. It speaks about Judah's progeny and how Shelah, the child from the Canaanite, as well as Perez and Zerah, all became clan leaders despite their genealogical origins. So this is a case of a Jewish father with a Gentile mothers in this case, and yet they were accepted in the community, they were tribal leaders, and everything seemed to be fine.
Yeah. And it's just, fascinating to see those verbal connections that I think that you've highlighted at the beginning and towards the end of Genesis 38, not the verses 1 to 4 and then 6 to 10 is what I'm thinking about here. But then further with Chronicles, which shows that even the descendants of Shelah are part of the Israelite or Judahite community. Because, nothing against the Talmud. I mean, we love to study Talmud for everyone. But I can imagine that maybe some of our viewers, some of our listeners, they're like, well, we don't read the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh in isolation from the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah, which is the rabbinic Torah, which is the Midrash and the Talmud, etc. And simply we could just say Tamar had converted or something like that, right?
Right.
But what we're doing here for the time being is, as I sometimes tell my own students, is we're reading these texts in their to the best of our ability in their original historical literary contexts, and there's no indication within the written text of any kind of conversion. We talked a bit about how conversion itself is this problematic category when we're dealing with ancient Israelite tribal identity. And so it seems like there's no issue with the fact that these children were born to a Canaanite mother
Right.
to be integrated into the Judahite tribe.
Right. And I believe in Genesis 46 as well, I think Simeon, it makes the remark that this one was from a Canaanite mother. So it shows an emphasis on the father as the transmitter of identity. You're absolutely right. In later Jewish works, so Canaanite, that gentilic noun, the signifying that you're a Canaanite, is used 70 sometimes in the Hebrew Bible, but there are a couple of times where it's translated as a merchant. And so I've seen that argument later on that she was not a daughter of a Canaanite, but a daughter of a merchant. And then, of course, Tamar's genealogy is constructed to be from Shem, which is a good genealogy in Genesis. So you're absolutely right. We do kind of reconfigure some of the story, kind of like the rewritten Bible. One thing I love in Jubilees, when they're telling the story again, I believe it's Jubilees, they make the remark that neither Er nor Onan actually had relations with Tamar. So they never actually went into her, which is why Judah was able to do that. Otherwise, it'd be kind of a form of incest. So it's interesting how they retell the stories and to kind of shape it around their priorities. But that's example number one. Another example, which I thought would be a little bit fun and in your wheelhouse, so please push back as much as you can. In this case, we looked at a Jewish father and a Gentile mother. This case, we have a Jewish mother and a Gentile father. Now, this is in Acts 16, so here we're going to the corpus of the New Testament, which I know we're timeline-wise, we're jumping ahead, but people like this example just because, A, it's slightly more familiar than, say, a Massa in the Hebrew Bible, but also because you're getting close to that matrilineal principle, right? So it's kind of like what's happening in the air, what's happening in the culture to be, is this kind of the underpinnings of the matrilineal principle. So Acts 16, if it's okay with you, Isaac, would you be willing to read it?
Yeah, absolutely. Paul went on also to Derbe and to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Now, while they were passing through the cities, they were delivering the ordinances for them to follow, which had been determined by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem.
Okay, good. So, $1,000,000 question, why would Paul circumcise Timothy? And I remember, this is like over a decade ago, I was doing this interview and we were in the green room in the back, and I was talking to this pastor, and he asked me, he's like, listen, I really have this question. Why would Paul circumcise Timothy when he writes elsewhere that if you get circumcised, the Messiah is of no value to you, right? So how do you reconcile these two things? Paul changed his mind, or it's a fabricated narrative. We don't really entertain that too much. We try to make this fit with what we have. So why would Paul circumcise Timothy? A very common proposal, which I'll respond to in a second, a very common proposal is because of this red portion right over here. Right, that he took him, he circumcised him because of the Jews in those places. Many people conclude, well, it was missiologically driven. It was because of missions, right? Because the Jews would have been bothered, and so therefore he circumcised him just so he could, continue preaching the gospel. And then they would often link that with, Paul's statement to the Jew, I became a Jew, and to one under the law as though he's just some type of chameleon that would do anything. I don't accept that view. And I instead take the viewpoint that, according to Luke, or Luke's Paul, Timothy is considered Jewish by virtue of his mother. That doesn't mean the matrilineal principle. It doesn't mean Luke thought Jewishness only ran through the mother, but it does mean the ambilineal principle, which is it could run through the mother or the father. And in this case, Timothy is considered Jewish and thus has to get circumcised. So was Timothy Jewish? I argue yes, he was Jewish. Why? First, the literary placement of Acts 16. So this is in Acts 16, 1 through 4. Right before you have Acts 15, and that's the Jerusalem Council. And in Acts 15, this is where they decide Gentiles do not need to be circumcised. They do not need to take on the yoke of the law. Instead, they just have to follow 4 principles. And they're kind of in the graces of the Messiah. They're found in the Messiah. They don't need to take on anything else. I think it'd be very bizarre if you have a whole section saying that Gentiles do not need to be circumcised, followed by a case where a Gentile is being circumcised. Right. Additionally, the whole purpose here is Paul's going on this trip. And the reason I include verse 4 is because after he circumcises him, it says, now while they were passing through the cities, they were delivering the ordinances that were determined by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem. So their point of going out was to deliver this message that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. It'd be very bizarre if right smack in the middle, you have by the way, here's a Gentile who's circumcised. So I think Paul is considering Timothy to be Jewish. The second thing is that this narrative functions as a necessary precursor. So in Acts 21, later on, Paul returns to Jerusalem and James comes up to him and they're rejoicing about Gentiles coming to faith. But then James says, there's this rumor about you, Paul, that you're telling Jews who live out of Judea, you're telling them not to circumcise their kids. What therefore should be done? Right? Like, obviously there's no merit to this. Therefore, what shall we do? And Paul goes, yes, absolutely, in more or less words. And he goes to the temple and he offers it to show that that's simply not the case. Well, Acts 16 is a good precursor because it shows that that's not what Paul held. And then the third thing is Paul's own approach to Titus. Titus also went with Paul on some missionary journeys, and yet in the book of Galatians, again, presuming Paul didn't change his mind or presuming that it properly reflects his viewpoint, he praises Titus for not being circumcised because he's a Gentile. And yet, by virtue of circumcising Timothy, I think the best argument could be made, he considered Timothy to be Jewish. Now, going back to that whole missiological argument here, because of the Jews who are in those places, I think one of the questions would be, would Jews have been bothered by an uncircumcised Gentile? Because you have the category of God-fearers. In Acts, when Paul's preaching, he's preaching to Jews and Gentiles. And so would Jews have been bothered by an uncircumcised Gentile, or perhaps an uncircumcised Jewish person would have been slightly more offensive? So I'm not sure that you could read this and argue it's strictly for missiological purposes. The second thing, which you and I have spoken about before, is Jews. Who are these Jews? Right. The assumption is these are Jews who don't believe in Jesus, and so therefore Paul is going to preach the gospel to them. Perhaps. But I don't know if that's a necessary conclusion, because again, the whole context is him taking the letter and delivering it to the churches there about this ruling. And so the Jews might very well be Jewish followers of Jesus who are now being told that Gentiles don't need to convert. So I don't hold the missiological view. I think that by virtue of the circumcision, Timothy is considered Jewish, and it's an example of someone with a Jewish mother and a Gentile father who was considered part of the tribe, at least according to Paul and Luke.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating text. It's an intriguing text, and I wish the author, of this text, traditionally called Luke, would have told us more, right? But is assuming a great part a great amount of knowledge on the part of the reader at that time. But yeah, again, for our audience who might be surprised, why are we dealing with a Christian text in a podcast about Jewishness and intermarriage in the Second Temple period in the Hebrew Bible, etc.? It's just that currently in biblical scholarship, more and more, and yours truly is one of the culprits for this tendency, is to assume that much that is in the New Testament was originally part and parcel of early Judaism, of Second Temple Judaism. And regardless of what one makes of that claim, in this New Testament text known as the Acts of the Apostles, dated anywhere from before 70 to the early second century CE, it makes references to Jewish characters. Now, these Jews, many of them, just happened to believe that Mashiach, the Messiah, had come, and it was Jesus, and he had risen from the dead. And now it was a time for everyone to recognize that reality. And lo and behold, here in Acts 16, 1 to 4, we have Paul, a Jew who initially was opposed to the Jesus movement and those who believed in the messiahship of Jesus. Now a follower of that movement, a promoter of that movement, who said in his own letters, especially Galatians, the letter he wrote, the letter to the Galatians, which is also in the New Testament, that Gentiles should not be circumcised. And here he seems to be what I like to call the first Christian Moel.
Yeah.
If he's actually performing the circumcision, which I've always
Right, right. Yeah, yeah,
wondered, because
exactly.
the text says he circumcised
Yeah.
Timothy. So did he actually do it, or did he have him circumcised? I mean, that's ambiguous, and it opens a whole other discussion: who performed circumcision in antiquity? And then the question is, well, why did he circumcise or have Timothy circumcised? Was it
Mhm.
because Timothy was considered to be Jewish? And usually in the scholarship, the way it goes is either you dismiss Acts as a evidence for a kind of like precursor to the rabbinic evidence of matrilineal principle. I think Shia Cohen kind of relativizes it. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, because I haven't read Shia Cohen for a long time on this particular passage. Because Shia Cohen, his thesis is matrilineal principle is not before the Mishnah.
Right, yeah, yeah. He has a whole. I think it's an appendix where he argues that Timothy is not Jewish,
Right.
but it's because of that dia clause, the because of the Jews clause
Because of
that it's
what you highlighted
missiological.
in red. But there's still a problem, I think. I am more privy today than 10 years ago to taking this passage, just speaking out loud here, as a taking it more seriously as evidence that there were Jews already when Acts was written. So we're talking first century at the very late second century, and I don't think Acts was written in the second century. That there were Jews who thought Jewishness was through the mother. Regardless of how one takes Paul's motivations, how one understands Paul's motivations for circumcising Timothy, there are Jews, and apparently those Jews think Timothy's Jewish in some way. I mean, you could read the passage that way. And so Shia Cohen seems to relativize it. Others seem to affirm here that we have evidence for the Jewishness through the mother. Now, what I really like about your discussion is the introduction of that with the four mottos at the beginning. That it could be maybe there were Jews who thought it was through the mother or through the father, ambilineal uh,
Yeah.
descent, which I had never thought of before, which
Hmm.
opens a whole other frontier for me to think about once this podcast is over.
Yeah, yeah. That's the thing. I mean, and I think people use it differently. Like when I read people's works and they appeal to patrilineal or matrilineal, I don't think they're using it in an exclusionary fashion. But
Hmm.
that's how I set it up, just
Okay.
to distinguish it from ambilineal and to show kind of that flexibility. Yeah. So Paul's or Luke's Paul here, I think a good case could be made that it's a Jewish mother and the child's Jewish, and he is accepted. Now, going on, we have our.
I'll just say
Oh,
one more thing here that might
Grace.
be of I mean, we could have a whole podcast just you and I on Acts 16 verses 1 to 4. I do think it's significant, and it's related to children of intermarried couples. The fact that Timothy is the child of an intermarried couple. And that ties in with Acts 21:21, as you point out. Later on, Paul, when he goes to Jerusalem, according to Acts 21:21, there he's the text says there are rumors that you, Paul, are teaching Jews not to circumcise their children.
Mhm.
It's not just don't you as an adult get circumcised or uncircumcise yourself, which epispasm, that was a thing that some Jews tried to do, surgically undo their circumcision. Is the text says don't that Paul is telling parents, don't bother with circumcising your children, and Timothy is the child of a intermarried couple. And Luke chapter 1-2, the Gospel of Luke, is written by the same author who wrote Acts, according to virtually all specialists. There you have Jesus, who is circumcised by his parents, or his parents have him circumcised, and also the parents of John the Baptist have their child circumcised. So this is really interesting. It's a passage that, in some way, regardless of how we understand it, whether it's an attestation already, and it would probably be, I don't know what you think about this, Michael, the earliest attestation to the matrilineal principle, if we take it as such, because it's before Mishnah. Regardless of how we understand that passage, with regard to matrilineal principle, is what I mean. It is clarifying within the book of Acts that for the author of Acts, Jews should continue to practice circumcision, should continue to observe the Torah, even if they become followers of Jesus. Right? That's just maybe a side note there, but
yeah. I don't know if they would have qualified it as even if, but right. Nothing changes. You know what I mean? By virtue of following Jesus from the Jerusalem Council. But yeah, I mean, whether it's a precursor to or an attestation to the matrilineal principle that eventually comes, the reason I would just put them in two different categories is just because the matrilineal principle is inherently exclusionary to patrilineal. I don't know if Paul would have been exclusionary to patrilineal if you take seriously his claim that he was a Pharisee, and you take Josephus's claim seriously that Josephus abides by the Pharisees, or at least their regulations, and there was commonality between them. Josephus viewed Jewishness as running through the father. Paul, I would assume, would see it running through either the mother or the father. But yeah, I mean, bringing up those cases in Luke is also interesting because, as we mentioned before, one of the interesting things about this is not just the mixed marriage, but also timing, because part of circumcision is sacred time. It's 8th-day circumcision that's important, and yet here you have a grown man, grown boy, however old he was, and yet he's being circumcised. So a lot to discuss in that Acts 16 passage. All right, so moving on now, we have, so we just finished with accepted, just for the sake of your viewers. Now it's going to go a lot quicker, so don't worry. We're just going to, you could see that there isn't too much here to discuss. But next we have accepted with limitations. So when dealing with the Hebrew Bible, Deuteronomy 23, I place the mamzer in this category. I argue that in Deuteronomy 23, there's a stipulation that a mamzer cannot enter into the community, neither an Ammonite or a Moabite, and I argue that the mamzer is a product of a mixed marriage with an Ammonite or Moabite. If I'm right, that would be one of the examples. We're not sure what the limitations would be, but by virtue of being branded as such, it's likely something. And then it's interesting, you actually have in a Dead Sea Scroll attestation to one Hananias Nothos. And Nothos is, Froelich argues that that's a translation of mamzer, so he's kind of Hananias the mamzer. And again, we don't know what that really meant, apart from the fact that they're being branded in this way. So there are cases likely where they're in the community, but there are limitations to them. But the example I just want to highlight here is found in Nehemiah 13. So Ezra and Nehemiah are often grouped together. These guys they're on the scene when Israel or the Judeans are coming back to Judea after Babylon, and they're leading them in how to rebuild Jerusalem and how to follow God and to make sure that they don't get exiled again. Now, with Nehemiah, even though they're often grouped together, I argue that they treat mixed offspring differently. And so Nehemiah, he still accepted the mixed offspring in the community. I don't think there's good evidence that he caused the men to divorce their wives and to kick anyone out, even though that claim is made. I think he was more inclusive in that sense, whereas Ezra is much more firm on the social boundaries. So looking at Nehemiah here, when Nehemiah comes In his work, he condemns intermarriage, which is now kind of a prolific topic in the Second Temple period. He condemns intermarriage largely because it either defiles the priesthood, idolatry, but it also bonds you to foreign people. It also makes political alliances, which is not good for this new community to be building their identity. And so in Nehemiah 13, 23 through 25, you see what really bothers him here. Would you be so kind as to
Right.
read that?
So in those days, also I saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the language of various people.
Right. So conversations are usually had about, what is the language of Ashdod here? Is it a specific dialect? Is it an Aramaic dialect? I think Myers makes that argument. Is it just, I think Williamson says that it's just encompassing foreignness. Like it's just other, and it's just using that term to demarcate it. Either way, to say that there's mixed offspring, a subset of them, half of them could not speak the Judean language. Again, that seems like a pretty easy problem to solve, right? You just teach them the Judean language. This is where some work is done on Nahar here. As a verb, it's a hifil that's used in Nehemiah. And when you look elsewhere at the hifil form of this verb, it's often means to recognize, to acknowledge, or something like that, to identify. And so I follow Kotziper here, where he argues that the notion that they could not speak the language doesn't mean they didn't have the ability to speak it, but it means that they were not interested in speaking it, that they had an attitude towards it. And so, what is language, right? I mean, I'm sure you appreciate this coming to Montreal, where we have, unfortunately, a divide with French and English, because language is not merely language. There's an entire culture and an identity embodied in language. Catherine Southwood works on this, and she does a tremendous job, especially for this Nehemiah passage, where she looks at how their ethnic identity is really being tied to their language here. It's like a symbol of ethnic association. So the issue here is not that a subset could not speak the language and they just had to learn it. A subset was against that Judean culture that was being created. And that's why Nehemiah is concerned with these intermarriages, because it creates political alliances with people who are not really with you. And so, what did that mean for the kids? Were they limited in their abilities? Were they prohibited from engaging in certain things? John Berquist makes a statement that, well, if they can't speak the language, they obviously didn't have any leadership roles or anything like that. I would venture to say that by virtue of their attitude towards the Judean culture, they were likely limited and held at an arm's length. Perhaps, by their own volition, but nevertheless, they're not deemed not Jewish. They're not kicked out, but they're likely set apart and in a negative fashion and somewhat limited in their contribution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes me think of it made me think of the debate a bit later on with the so-called Jewish Hellenizers in First Maccabees during the Maccabean Revolt, who wanted to do away with Jewish practices that were like obstacles for further assimilation into wider Greek Hellenistic culture. I mean, my mind just went that way because I had not thought of, they didn't speak the languages, like we're not interested in the language because it's part of this Judean culture that's being created here, that we're not interested or even opposed to.
Right. Yeah, and I just appreciate, you hear people leaving, for example, just in a contemporary fashion, people leaving Montreal. And I remember reading one guy's interview, and he moved to Toronto, which is the much more Anglophone city in Canada. Because for your viewers, they likely know Montreal is located in Quebec, where the official language is French. But Montreal as a city is quite bilingual. But nevertheless, there are we have a whole organization here that works on protecting the French language. And so there are laws about, that French has to be bigger than the English, or if you move to Montreal and you're not from here, you have to go to a French school. Like they're trying to protect the French language.
Right.
And there's a lot of identity that's wrapped in that. There's a lot of history that's wrapped in that. And so when people move away, they say, like, I'm so glad I could speak. And it doesn't automatically have to convey a political statement, about like where I stand. in the midst of everything. And I appreciate that tension, and I think it sheds some light on Nehemiah 13 and how language functions.
I'll just say I prefer Montreal than Toronto, but
Yeah,
maybe I
you and
shouldn't
me
say this
both.
on a video that's going to be uploaded online. We'll lose some subscribers or we'll gain some others.
Yeah. Well, listen, I lived in Hamilton, which is 45 minutes from Toronto. And listen, it's a good experience. It's just you don't have that language tension there.
Right.
Quite like
That's
you
an
do here.
interesting analogy. We
Yeah.
need analogies. I use them a lot in class to make sense of these texts written a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
There you go. All right. Third to last, we have our famous excluded. And again, this Ezra narrative it's one of the most popular ones just because it's so antithetical to what you find before. We're all trying to figure out the rationale here. And then also, many people argue this is the start of that matrilineal principle. And I would say that probably a good case could be made in that way, that this starts it. I don't hold to that. I view him as holding to what we're going to call bilineal descent. Both parents had to be Jewish. But nevertheless, it is used in that conversation. So Ezra 9 here, Ezra 9. So you can see I jump ahead a lot right here. That little hyphen that includes Ezra's essential repentance on behalf of the people. But Ezra, he is a scribe. He's a priest. He comes to Jerusalem in order to lead the people back to God. His main thing is intermarriage. He doesn't want any intermarriage. To him, this is what initially kicked us out of the land, and we just got back. You guys are doing the same thing again. So he sets up really strong social boundaries, right? About like who's in, who's out. And over here we have in 9:1 where he arrives, he witnesses the intermarriage that's happening. He repents, hence the ellipsis. And then we have the regulation here that we're going to kick them all out. So would you be so kind, Isaac?
I will be so kind. The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons. Thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands. So now let us make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children. Let it be done according to the law.
Yeah, and that's a big point. Let it be done according to the law. And it's kind of, well, what law are we talking about here? So, a couple of things. First, the people of Israel married with the peoples of the land. Big question is, who are these peoples of the land? Again, depending on who you read, it could be the Judeans who stayed there and were not exiled, and now they're considered other. It could be the Samaritans, or it could just be any foreigner, kind of a general title. But I think that two things are going on here for us to say, let it be done according to the law. First, notice what he says, the people of the land and their abomination, they have not separated themselves from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Amorites. Most of these groups were not in existence anymore. You don't have the Canaanites or the Hittites or anything like that. And so what is he appealing to? Who is he referencing here? And you're going to see the red. These are the nations that correlate with the initial regulation against intermarriage in Deuteronomy 7. So in Deuteronomy 7, going all the way back, Israel was never prevented from intermarriage as a whole. They're actually told in Deuteronomy 20 or 22, they're told when you go to a faraway land, and you can get a woman, you can bring her back just to cut her nails, 30 days, all that kind of stuff, but she gets absorbed into the community. You can marry someone from a faraway land, but you cannot marry the 7 Canaanite nations. That was the prohibition against intermarriage. And so what Ezra does here is he takes that title and he broadens it now to all foreign women. He essentially takes the kind of enemy title and he makes it emblematic of all notions of intermarriage now. That the peoples of the land, the foreigners and their abominations, and he uses these titles here. And he also adds the Ammonites and the Moabites. This comes from Deuteronomy 23. Neither the Ammonites nor the Moabites were allowed in up to the 10th generation. And then he includes the Egyptians as well, which obviously was a continued culture at this point. But the argument here is that essentially, according to the law, he quotes Deuteronomy 7, but he broadens the application. right? Just as the Canaanites, we couldn't marry them, now you cannot marry any foreign women and their children. That's the first thing that he does, broadens it. The second thing he does, which I find fascinating, is that he shifts the rationale. So in Deuteronomy 7, the reason that you are not allowed to intermarry with them, don't make a covenant with them, why? Because they're going to turn your children away from following me. Meaning, it's really about kind of cultic practice, what we could call idolatry. They're going to turn you away to worship Ashtaroth or Baal or whoever else, right? It's all about kind of your belief, if we could use that term.
Mm-hmm.
The rationale with Ezra changes. It's not about because they're going to turn you away from following me, but rather, don't intermarry with them, don't give your daughters for their sons. Thus, the holy seed has mixed itself. So whereas this one, Deuteronomy was much more concerned about your cultic practice and what you follow, Ezra is much more concerned about your genealogy and that you've mixed yourself. And again, I think this goes back to, we spoke about this before, but that priestly criterion, only the priests were prohibited from intermarrying with anyone because it will render their seed impure or profane. Here, Ezra takes that and he broadens it to all of Israel. So if I could summarize it this way, Ezra essentially is taking the law and he's broadening it.
Mm-hmm.
He takes the law in Deuteronomy 7 against intermarriage and he broadens it to all foreigners. And then he takes the law in Leviticus for the priest and he broadens it to all Israel. And so what that means is no one from Israel can marry a foreigner, otherwise your seed is no longer holy. And that's why the children and the foreigners are kicked out.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, there's a lot here too. I mean, in other words, based on this presentation of Ezra, we have here an example of bilateral
Right.
consent. Both parents have to be Israelites or Jewish for the child to be an Israelite or a Jew.
Right. And here you and like Michael Fishbane has worked a lot on the interpretive methods that Ezra uses here, which is really fascinating. But yeah, the application of these laws and the contemporization of them, reapplying it in order to construct these strong social boundaries.
Yeah, what caught my attention too was, like, as you're saying, Ezra is broadening the application of what we see in Deuteronomy. Intermarriage is forbidden, period. I mean, in Deuteronomy, it's intermarriage with certain non-Israelites, mainly those that were in the land of Israel, the Holy Land. But what caught my attention with Ezra is, like, don't even marry Egyptians. The Egyptians, what came to my mind, and it's another text we could have added to the discussion, but there are so many texts on that are relevant for what we're talking about. Joseph. I mean,
Right.
Joseph
Exactly.
marries an Egyptian woman, Joseph and
Yeah.
Asenath.
Asenath.
And it's,
Hmm.
again, nothing against the rabbinic interpretation, rabbinic midrash that comes later, at least is attested later in writing. But I've heard all kinds of, agadah, so stories that, well, Asenath was Jewish because somehow she was a descendant of Dinah, one of Jacob's, the only daughter that's mentioned,
Right.
besides the 12 sons of Jacob. And so she was Jewish, and it runs through the mother. Dinah is a woman. And so Joseph didn't marry a non-Israelite because then you have the problem that his sons, right, Ephraim and Manasseh, he brings them to Jacob later on, and Jacob blesses them sans plus, without further ado, as if they're, part of the community of Israel. But the text itself, right, the biblical text itself doesn't seem to present any anxieties about Joseph marrying a non-Jew or a non-Israelite, an Egyptian. And Egyptians are not singled out in Deuteronomy as people you can't intermarry with.
Yeah.
It's those 7 nations or so from Canaan. So
Yeah.
we have an expansive view here in Ezra, very restrictive, where both parents have to be Jewish. Because you could also, just thinking about the matrilineal principle, not trying to refute that. I respect that. But this is actually, interestingly, often the passage that is solicited to argue that Jewishness runs through the mother. And that's why Ezra rejects the woman here, because a Jew has to be born to a Jewish mother, and the mothers aren't Jewish.
Right.
But I guess you would say, or others would say in response to that, why not just convert them and then all the children would be considered Jewish?
You're asking why not convert them?
I mean, in response to the argument that this is actually a text that assumes Jewishness runs through the mother,
Yeah.
you could
Oh,
say in
why not
reply,
convert the mothers? Well, yeah. Well, as we mentioned before, I don't know if there was really a category of
right,
conversion at this point, but
yeah,
then B, and more importantly, when you're dealing with genealogy, so this is what Christine Hayes calls the genealogical impurity.
mhm,
There's no safeguarding against this. Like you're in or out. And so when we mentioned before, there were some communities who rejected conversion as a possibility. Those were ones who would hold to this genealogical purity. Say whatever you want, believe whatever you want. You don't
right,
have the right genes. You're not part of the holy seed. So
yeah,
uh, I don't know if Ezra would have held to that, but it fits within that paradigm.
right,
But yeah, it is fascinating that the Egyptians are included in here. As you noted, yeah, Joseph and Asenath. There's a whole Second Temple work about her conversion on the with 8 days and all that. So it's obviously something that they're grappling with and they're trying to rectify. But you start seeing this broadenization here and demonization of foreigners because they take on the names of Israel's ancient enemies, if you would, or people in the land that they weren't allowed to intermarry with.
yeah. I guess what I know the language of conversion is problematic because it's a bit anachronistic. But I guess what one could say in reply to that, because there's an argument made by those that read Ezra in light of rabbinic Torah or Torah, that Ezra and Nehemiah, for that matter, uh, are attest to the matrilineal principle because the women here, they're not Israelites or they're not Jewish,
Right.
and that's why they're being rejected. And I guess someone like Christina Hayes, who wrote a book on Gentiles and impurity in the Second Temple and early rabbinic period, she would say, or others would say, in response to something like that, or their idea is, well, for someone like Ezra, the author who wrote Ezra, you can't become an Israelite. You're born an Israelite. So there's not even this would apply even in the case if there was a male, let's say a non-Israelite male who wanted to become an Israelite. Well, sorry, your parents aren't Jewish. And circumcision, furthermore, at least that's clear in the book of, seems to be clear in the book of Jubilees, has to be performed on the eighth day because it's only a child, a male child born to two parents who are Jewish, who's circumcised on the eighth day. That's a Jew, as far as Jewish males are concerned. There's no opportunity or option provided here. Oh, let's circumcise them. Let's convert them, so to speak,
Right.
integrate them into the community.
Yeah, and I think that goes all the way back to the rationale that's used. It's genealogical. The Holy Seed has mixed itself,
Right.
just as you would have, and this is the precursor for it. The priest intermarries. This seed is profane. It's not holy. So now all of Israel, your seed is not holy. I mean, believe what you want, but you can't get in. So that's the argument for the criterion that's used here. Now, in terms of the matrilineal principle, again, I think a good argument could be made that this is the beginning of it.
Okay.
And one of the reasons is because you don't see Ezra kicking out the men, foreign men. And so it seems like it's really strictly kind of
Okay.
a woman issue. And because Jewishness runs through the woman, listen, I think it's a
That's
somewhat
interesting.
fair argument. It's just not one I hold to simply because the rationale here is really about the mixing of the seed, which you need both parents for. So there's kind of an emphasis on both of them. And also, when you look at later texts that kind of inherited this model, it isn't matrilineal; it's bilineal. It's both parents are
Right.
necessary. So you don't really see the matrilineal principle until you get to the Mishnah. So that's why I would put the brakes on jumping on that
Hmm.
argument, but I could definitely see the merit to it.
Well, that's thanks for sharing that. I never thought of yeah, the other way around. It's true that if there were non-Israelite males who had married Israelite females, women, Ezra
Yeah,
doesn't reject them, and you could use that as argument for matrilineal principle. No, thanks
you
for sharing
could.
that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, exactly.
it's almost as if this author Ezra took the phrase in Exodus, I believe, you are a mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests, to the
Hmm.
letter. Like all of
Exactly.
you, Israelites are going to be like priests, and
Yeah.
priests cannot intermarry. So you're not going to intermarry.
Exactly. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. In terms of like the passages that he's connecting together, that's the rationale that he arrives with. He broadens it and he makes it more exclusive in that sense. Because yeah, when you read the Torah, there are different senses to being holy or to being set apart. Israel's set apart, but they're not set apart like the priests are set apart. Ezra merges those two categories. Now, granted, of course, you still have priests who are, distinct. In Dead Sea Scrolls and 4QMT speaks about them being, extra holy, or I'm trying to remember the term,
Super
but
duper holy.
set apart. But nevertheless, that's Ezra's rationale here, which is why you could kick out the foreigners and their children because they're not part of the holy seed, which is sad. But nevertheless, we'll continue on and we'll finish up here with the last category, excluded and hybrid, which again is some, I don't want to say flimsy because it's a category I use, but it's sort of one of those, I'm massaging it and trying to convey it the best I could. But essentially where Ezra would say you're profane and you're gone, excluded and hybrid would say you're not just profane, you're actually somewhat morally wicked. Like you are part of a bad mixture, and this is going to come out in your actions. Now, there's two texts that I think kind of at least deal with this paradigm to some extent. The first is First Enoch, and the second is Jubilees, which I think relies on First Enoch and then also applies it to some narratives. But essentially, in First Enoch, if any of your viewers saw, remember that 2014 movie, Noah? It's 2014?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah. Russell Crowe. Anyway, so you have like these giants walking around and everyone's like, oh my gosh, that's not in the Bible.
Right.
So that comes from this story in First Enoch. And essentially, there's a sexual union between celestial and terrestrial women, right? Angels are having sexual relations with women. You see... in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, there's kind of this cryptic little passage that seems to indicate that that's what's going on. They have the birth of the Nephilim, and you're not really sure if there's kind of if they're the descendants of them. But in First Enoch, they really go all out on this story. And essentially, you have angels who have sexual relations with women, and they give birth to these giants. And I'm not going to get into kind of the textual history and a difference between different parts of Enoch. But what ends up happening is, and I have the passage here. Actually, Isaac, if you would.
Right.
Sorry, God is talking to Gabriel, the angel, and the bastards in question are these giants, the descendants of that intermarried union.
So go, Gabriel, to the bastards, to the half-breeds, to the sons of miscegenation, and destroy the sons of the watchers from among the sons of men.
Right. Now, I guess the question is, why would this story even exist? Why would you have this narrative about angelic beings having sex with women? And some people argue it's kind of an anti-Greek narrative for the Diadochi, that the Diadochi claim to be gods, and so that's why they're depicted this way, and that they're being oppressed by them. Other people make an argument that I adopt in the book, which is that this is kind of an anti-priest, or at least is condemning what some of the priests were doing, in that they were having illicit relations and they were birthing illegitimate children. And what you see here are that the very titles used become emblematic of what we would deem mixed offspring later on in Second Temple literature. So the term bastards here, Mazareus, I argue, not me alone, but I follow the argument that this is related to mamzer, which is an illicit union, kind of a translation of it. The half-breeds here, the Greek term, this is only used twice in the Septuagint, and it's the passage in Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 22, where it's essentially the prohibition against mixing seed, against plowing with different animals. It's not wanting to mix at all, and yet these have become the mixed ones, the half-breeds. And later on in Jewish literature, Second Temple Jewish literature, these passages become kind of the go-to to condemn intermarriage. Like, you shall not mix. So here, these guys are the half-breeds. And then finally, sons of miscegenation. The word is porneia, which is a relatively common term for sexual immorality, but it is used for intermarriage. And so I argue that this really sets the stage for what we call these mixed offspring. And it's not just that they're profane, but they're kind of this hybrid, half-half. And what ends up happening in Enoch is that when they go and they kill these giants, their spirits, because they're not men and they're not bodies, they can't fully go into the ground because they cannot go back up because they're, half men. They stay on the earth and their spirits go around and they terrorize. And it's kind of an etiology for like demons and wickedness on the earth. And there you have the connection with their moral impurity, their wickedness. So the hybrid leads to their wickedness there. And I believe Stuckenbrook is the one who makes that argument as to why they're actually wicked. He mentions that these spirits are the product of a reprehensible union and thus are inherently wicked. And so this model, it's not widely adopted in Second Temple literature, but I do argue that Jubilees relies on it to some extent. Jubilees is a later work that's essentially a rewriting of Genesis and Exodus, at least the first portion of Exodus. And in Jubilees, they also hold to holy seed. Like both parents need to be Jewish, kind of like what Ezra was saying, that if you intermarry, you will be profane, you're going to lose your status. And I'm actually working on this right now, so unfortunately it's not in the book. But I contrast the children of Esau and the children of Jacob. And Esau, even though he was from a proper marriage, you could see he hated his brother, but then he turned to love him. And so Kugel, for example, says it's because he had that proper lineage, but he married a Canaanite and his kids were inherently wicked. Whereas Jacob's kids were righteous. And so you see this come out in the war because they're going to fight each other because Esau changed his mind again. They're going to fight each other. Jacob's kids were like, we're not even going to attack Esau because he is your brother. He is like you. Whereas Esau's children said to Esau, we're going to kill you if you don't fight with us. And so you see that kind of moral impurity because of the relation with the Canaanites. And so it adds another layer to that hybrid status where it's not just you're out, but like you're out and you're wicked.
Yeah, I really like the four mottos. I mean, because there are nuances here that otherwise we might not discern. With the third motto, it's excluded, but this fourth motto, it's excluded and hybrid. There might have not been a moralizing, or there need not have been a moralizing stigma attached to someone who's not an Israelite. You're profane in the sense of you're not an Israelite. We're Israelites, so you don't have to do what we have to do, and you're not forbidden from doing certain things that we're forbidden from doing according to the Torah. There's holy, there's common, but then
Right.
there can be this moralizing attitude attached to that which is not holy.
Yeah.
That is apparently present here in First Enoch and in Jubilees, where this miscegenation is the result of a sinful act, porneia. Yeah, I mean, I just I didn't, think about it that way. So I really appreciate that. Gabriele Boccaccini would be very happy. We're talking about first Enoch in this podcast because he has done more than anyone else for the study of Enoch, first Enoch, perhaps on this
Right.
planet. And I'm happy too, as co-director of the Enoch Seminar, which we don't just talk about Enoch, we talk about anything Second Temple Judaism. So it's great to have this text plugged in here into the conversation. People might be surprised again. What are we doing talking about Enoch? Enoch's not in the rabbinic canon. Yes, that's true. It's not in the Tanakh, but First Enoch was a very important Second Temple Jewish work. So work it's a composite work. We can't get into the
Right.
details here in the Book of Watchers. Might date from the third, maybe even a little before century BCE, and was widely read by many Jews and was influential as well within Christianity. And Jubilees just a little later in the second century BCE, building on some of the traditions that are in First Enoch.
Yeah. Yeah. And listen, I mean, the correlation with, I don't want to say a wicked child, but a child who's going to
Mhm.
suffer because of the sins of the parents. Like there's precedent for that, and wisdom
Mhm.
literature talks about children, from illegitimate unions that like they won't have a long life. But here it really connects to intermarriage, and you have that moral impurity. And in terms of the function of these stories, likely to
Right.
safeguard and to unironically demonize those who are mixed. So yeah, so this goes to the four kind of broad categories again, by virtue of placing, excuse me, some texts all in accepted. It doesn't mean they all agreed on how lineage was constructed,
Right.
but it goes back to, as you mentioned, today there's diversity with how lineage is established, and in the Hebrew
Right.
Bible, all the way into Second Temple, it really depends who you ask. Lineage was the primary factor. There
Mm.
were other elements like where you lived. I do think that that was a matter. So, for example, Hiram of Tyre, his mother was Jewish and his father was not, but he's never called an Israelite. Whereas Amasa, in the exact same genealogy, he was considered an Israelite because he lived in Judea. He lived in that area, and so I think location was an important factor as well,
Mm.
which is why with Israel today, it adds an element of identity and reconsidering and where these conversations go. But yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I love the fact that there's renewed conversation again with the research, with the Pew Research, McGinnity, these people who are writing on intermarriage and identity. Will anything change? I have absolutely no idea, but I love the fact that we're just more aware of the implications of the matrilineal principle, some of the difficulties that people grapple with, and I think we should be sensitive to that. So yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, thanks for that. I mean, the dictum comes to my mind after this presentation: three Jews, four opinions. And you provided us with four different models for thinking about intermarriage, about Jewishness within the Hebrew Bible, as well as during the Second Temple period, looking with a nod toward what comes later in the rabbinic tradition, the matrilineal principle. Michael, is there any other final comment? Anything else you feel like I missed or that you wanted to add here
No,
before
I
we
love
go?
your feedback. I think if anyone has any feedback, any pushback, any texts, by all means, let us know.
Mhm.
We want to be as thorough and as fair as possible. But no concluding statement. Yeah.
So yeah, for our viewers, you can leave a comment below the recording. Share your reaction with us. Maybe you're on academia. I don't know. Do you have an academia.edu
Yeah,
page?
I do need to update it, but I am on academia.edu. If you look me up, you could feel free to email me. I'd love to hear from anyone who has any feedback or alternative viewpoints. Um, I wish I was a little bit more involved in social media. Unfortunately, I've come to realize that Facebook is no longer the up and coming thing, and people have moved on. And I'm trying to get back with the times. So either email or Facebook are the best ways to reach me, and I'd love to hear from anyone who has any thoughts on this.
And any news on the forthcoming book, Children from Intermarried Couples in the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Period with Brill?
Uh, Currently got the feedback, implemented all of it, going through the edits right now, and hopefully it'll be off, within the next month or so.
Oh, really? Like
Hopefully.
published?
Not published, no, sending it
Okay.
back after all
Oh,
the
send it
edits
back. All
are
right.
done.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, right. Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael Gabizon,
Thank you.
for your time. It's been Michael Gabizon talking today to us about children from intermarried couples in the Hebrew Bible and the Second Temple period.